Hi there, I'm Dr. Connie Ridley Smith, and I'm here to talk to you about symbiotic intelligence, more commonly known as SYM-Q. Today I'd like to spend some time talking to you about the terminologies that will be used in our programs, terminologies that may be unknown to you, but by the time we finish, you will be as well versed in these terminologies as we are. We have interviewed scores and scores of individuals in conjunction with our SYM-Q research, and we found one thing that I like to call the ability to make quick adjustments. That skill, the ability to make quick adjustments above all others, is the critical factor to succeeding in an intercultural environment. I'll share with you some of the skills and some of the examples of that skill that our interviewees have shared with us. For example, when they've been invited to dinner and instead of sitting at a table in a chair, they've been asked to sit on the floor, and they willingly do that. Or when they arrive for a dinner function and they find that the men and the women will be seated in separate dining areas, and they go along with that practice even though it is not their own particular culture or norm. When they enter public places and they see that everyone is barefoot and they're not accustomed to that in their own culture, because in their own culture the rule is no shoes, no service. Or when sitting and talking to someone, being careful to point one's feet away from that individual as opposed to straight on towards that individual, because in a particular culture that would be seen as an insult. And making sure that you dress in the style and in the value system that is prevalent in the society, in the culture. Because people look at these things, either your observance of their cultural idioms and norms, and they look at the way that you present yourself, and they make an immediate value judgment simply because they're human. But today we've been talking about these occurrences, and all of them are steeped in the big word culture. And what is culture? Culture is a set of values and norms and beliefs and practices that are indigenous to a group of people who reside in a common space. And when everyone resides in a common space and they operate by the similar beliefs and customs and values and norms, there is said to be cultural consistency. What happens when a newcomer comes into that culturally consistent environment? There happens to be something called cultural complexity. And when cultural complexity happens, all of the norms and the agreed upon practices of the culture start to fray away a little bit, because persons bring their own cultural values and norms that are indigenous to where they were born and raised, and then you have the ones of the environment, and there's sort of sometimes a disconnect. Sometimes there's not a complete mesh of those different ideals and practices and norms. And that is called by intercultural complexity. So when everybody is born and raised and believing the same set of values and norms, the cultural complexity is said to be low. But when there's the presence of diversity, people from different backgrounds, from people from different locations, it increases the cultural complexity. And if they are from international locations, it's called intercultural complexity. And why is that a big deal? Because we have found that when intercultural complexity rises, a commodity known as cultural consensus falls or decreases. What's cultural consensus? Cultural consensus is that phenomenon that exists when everyone thinks, believes, and practices the same set of cultural values. And even without speaking to each other or winking or getting each other's attention to signal, something can happen and all persons will agree, because they are evaluating what just happened based upon their idea of cultural consensus and what is the norm. That leads to cultural congruence. Cultural congruence is simply the compatibility between a culture and the introduction of a new activity or a new member. So for example, cultural congruence is said to be very valuable in primary grade education because to the extent that the teacher delivering the education has the same cultural values and norms as the culture in which the child is being raised, then there is a compatibility in the messages that are being sent, and that contributes to cultural congruence. Of course, when you're looking for critical thinking and when you're looking for a broad spectrum of viewpoints, then cultural congruence is not necessarily the most precious commodity in education because there is a richness that diversity does bring. So we've been talking about all of these definitions and scenarios, but how does it play out in real life? What happens when you enter a new culture and then you have a different set of values at play? How do you handle it? Well, none of us is perfect, but let me express to you what happened to me once I was traveling into a very small remote village somewhere in Europe. The place will remain undisclosed. But when I got there, I went to the bank to cash my traveler's checks, and I went to the post office to mail off my postcards. And I noticed that as I was in the queue, instead of getting closer and closer to the counter, I was actually getting further and further away, and I couldn't understand it. Every mail that was entering the building was entering, but not getting behind me. They were getting in the queue ahead of me. And I realized then I was getting further and further. I eventually did get served, but not before every male who needed to be served was served ahead of me. I didn't say anything because, of course, as a newcomer to a new environment, you need to do more listening and observing than you do speaking and complaining. And after all, I wasn't getting physically harmed. And so I just took that in stride and made a mental note of it. But then I started to notice other occurrences in the culture that reinforced that women had a certain place in society and that everyone else shared the consensus. And I felt like I was the only person who was noticing it or having a problem with it. So I did not say anything, but later in my venture and in my journeys, I did end up talking to another cultural member who was female. And as I noticed something that happened particularly to her, I noticed how she handled it, and we began to discuss it and discuss the matter. And she told me that that was quite true, that women had a certain place, but the way they handled it was that all of the professional women got together and they even purchased their own mode of transportation because in that particular country and that particular region, it was common practice for the women to have to give up their seats when men got onto the bus. And so that was the cultural norm. That was the cultural consensus. And what I had to do is what I advise many people to do. When you're faced with a norm that is not your own and you're visiting in another culture, to take it in stride and to try to learn something from it. But don't try to challenge it because cultures are not easily changed, if ever. And they certainly won't be changed by a newcomer who is visiting and is transient in the country for a short time. This is just the way culture operates. SYM-Q can help because it can help you to become aware of the 4 different areas in which these cultural clashes, cultural incompatibilities may occur, and then we can help to provide strategies that will help you not only to recognize them so that you can make your quick adjustments, but so that you can understand them and that they do not consume you, and you can still matriculate in the culture and get the value that you had intentionally intended to get out of your intercultural experience. I invite you to take our course, the SYM-Q Navigator. or to register for our online coaching packages. All of our courses are completely online and mobile friendly. You'll be able to take SYM-Q tips with you wherever you go. Register today at SYM-Q4us@gmail.com. SYM-Q4us@gmail.com. This has been Dr. Connie Ridley Smith, and thank you for tuning into the SYM-Q moment. We hope we've been helpful to you, and we look forward to having you in our classes. SYM-Q, it resonates with the way people want to experience intercultural settings. Are you ready to SYM-Q?